In the winter of 1847, when the Great Plains turned into a frozen wasteland that claimed more lives than any war, survival meant making impossible choices. Sarah Mackenzie never imagined that her desperate offer to a Comanche warrior would teach her the true meaning of honor. Sometimes the most profound lessons come from those we least expect, in moments when death whispers closer than the wind through winter trees. This is the story of two souls from different worlds who discovered that humanity transcends all boundaries, even in the face of nature's most brutal test. The wagon wheel cracked with a sound like thunder, and Sarah Mackenzie knew their journey west had just become a fight for survival. The wooden spokes splintered against the frozen ground as her husband Thomas struggled to control their two oxen, their breath forming white clouds in the bitter December air. Behind them, their 3 children huddled under moth-eaten blankets, their faces pale with cold and fear. "Papa, why did we stop?" asked little Emma, her 7-year-old voice barely audible over the howling wind that had been building strength all morning. The sky above them had turned the color of old pewter, heavy with the promise of snow that would make the already treacherous trail through Nebraska territory nearly impossible to navigate. Thomas Mackenzie wiped the sweat from his forehead despite the freezing temperature. His calloused hand shook as he examined the broken wheel, knowing what Sarah already feared. They were still 3 days from Fort Kearney, the nearest outpost where they might find shelter and supplies. Winter on the Great Plains was unforgiving, and they had been traveling later in the season than wise folks would attempt. "We can fix this," Thomas said, though the uncertainty in his voice betrayed his words. He had been a blacksmith back in Ohio, skilled with metal and fire, but out here on the endless prairie, his tools felt inadequate against the vast wilderness that stretched in every direction. The wind cut through their heavy coats like they were made of paper, and Sarah pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. Their middle child, 10-year-old Jacob, climbed down from the wagon to help his father. The boy had grown serious beyond his years during their months of travel, understanding without being told that their situation was precarious. Baby Rebecca, just 2 years old, cried softly in Sarah's arms, her tiny hands red with cold despite the mittens her mother had knitted from their last good wool. Sarah looked across the empty landscape, searching for any sign of shelter or help. The prairie grass bent low under the increasing wind, creating waves that rippled toward the horizon like a brown ocean. In the distance, dark clouds gathered with ominous intent, and she could smell snow in the air. It was the kind of storm that old-timers talked about in hushed voices, the kind that buried entire wagon trains and wasn't discovered until spring. "Thomas," she called out, trying to keep the fear from her voice for the children's sake. "How long do you think this repair might take?" Her husband looked up from where he knelt beside the broken wheel, his face grim. The iron rim had come loose, and 2 of the wooden spokes were cracked beyond any quick repair. Even if they had the proper tools, which they didn't, it would take hours of work in increasingly dangerous conditions. "Maybe we should make camp here and wait for the storm to pass," Thomas said quietly. But Sarah could see in his eyes that he knew what she knew. Making camp in the open with a blizzard coming would be suicide. They needed shelter, real shelter, not just the canvas cover of their wagon. As if summoned by their desperation, the first snowflakes began to fall. They were large and heavy, the kind that meant business. Within minutes, the wind picked up even more, and the snow began falling faster, already starting to accumulate on the frozen ground. Emma started to cry. Not the typical whining of a tired child, but the frightened sobs of someone who sensed real danger. Jacob tried to comfort his sister while helping his father, but Sarah could see the boy's own fear in the way his hands trembled as he held the broken wagon parts. "We need to find shelter now," Sarah said, raising her voice over the wind. She stood up in the wagon, baby Rebecca still in her arms, and scanned the landscape more desperately. The snow was falling heavier now, and visibility was decreasing by the minute. That's when she saw him. At first, it was just a dark shape moving against the white backdrop of the storm. Sarah squinted, wiping snow from her eyes, trying to make out what it might be. As the figure came closer, her heart began to race for an entirely different reason than the cold. It was a man on horseback, and even from a distance she could tell he was Indian. His horse moved with the easy confidence of an animal accustomed to harsh conditions, and the rider sat straight despite the driving snow. As he approached, Sarah could make out more details that confirmed her fears. He wore a heavy buffalo robe and leather leggings, and his long black hair whipped in the wind beneath what looked like a fur hat. Thomas had seen him too, and slowly stood up, his hand instinctively moving toward the rifle they kept in the wagon. But Sarah noticed something that made her heart skip. The rider's horse was struggling against the wind and snow just like any animal would, and the man himself seemed to be seeking shelter just as desperately as they were. The Comanche warrior, for that's what Sarah was certain he was based on the stories she'd heard from other travelers, brought his horse to a stop about 30 yards away. He sat there for a long moment, studying their broken wagon and their family. Sarah could feel his dark eyes taking in their situation, the crying children, the broken wheel, the approaching storm that threatened to kill them all. Thomas tightened his grip on his rifle, but the weapon remained pointed at the ground. The wind howled between them, carrying snow that stung like tiny needles against exposed skin. Baby Rebecca's cries grew louder, and Emma pressed closer to Jacob, both children sensing the tension that had nothing to do with the weather. For what felt like an eternity, the two men simply looked at each other across the snowy expanse. Sarah found herself holding her breath, waiting to see what would happen. She had heard terrible stories about Indian raids, about families murdered and children taken, but she had also heard other stories of natives who helped lost travelers, who shared food and shelter when civilization was hundreds of miles away. The warrior nudged his horse forward slowly, and Sarah could see that he was younger than she had first thought, perhaps in his late 20s. His face was weathered by sun and wind, marked with what looked like deliberate scars along his cheekbones. He wore no war paint that she could see, and his hands remained visible and empty of weapons, though she was sure he carried them. When he was close enough to speak without shouting over the wind, he stopped again. His English, when it came, was accented but clear. "Bad storm coming," he said, his voice carrying easily despite the howling wind. "Very bad. You die here." The bluntness of his statement sent a chill through Sarah that had nothing to do with the cold. Thomas shifted his weight, still uncertain whether this encounter would turn violent. "We're trying to fix our wagon," Thomas called back. "We'll be fine once we get moving again." The warrior looked at the broken wheel, then at the darkening sky where snow was now falling so thick it was hard to see more than a few dozen yards in any direction. He shook his head slowly. "No time for fix," he said. "Storm kill you before wheel ready. I know place. Safe place. You come now or you die." Sarah felt her heart pounding as she looked between her husband and the stranger who might be their salvation or their doom. The snow was already beginning to accumulate on the wagon cover, and the wind was strong enough to rock their heavy wagon back and forth. Baby Rebecca's cries had turned to weak whimpers, and even Jacob was shivering uncontrollably, despite his heavy coat. "How do we know you're not leading us into a trap?" Thomas asked, his voice tight with suspicion and fear. The warrior's expression didn't change, but Sarah thought she saw something that might have been understanding in his dark eyes. "You not know," he said simply, "but storm not lie. Storm kill, sure, I maybe not kill. You choose." The simple logic of his statement hit Sarah like a physical blow. They were going to die out here in this wagon, she was suddenly certain of it. The storm was getting worse by the minute, and even if they managed some kind of temporary repair to the wheel, they'd never outrun the blizzard to reach Fort Kearney. But following a Comanche warrior into the wilderness might be walking straight into death of a different kind. Emma's frightened voice cut through her thoughts. "Mama, I'm so cold. I can't feel my feet anymore." Sarah looked down at her daughter and saw that the little girl's lips were starting to turn blue despite the blankets wrapped around her. Jacob wasn't much better, and baby Rebecca had gone quiet in a way that terrified Sarah more than her crying had. She made her decision. "Thomas!" she called out, her voice firm despite her fear. "We have to trust him." "The children won't survive the storm in the wagon." Her husband looked at her as if she had lost her mind. But before he could argue, the warrior spoke again. "I am called Ayana," he said, using what Sarah assumed was his Comanche name. "My woman, my children, they die in winter like this 3 seasons ago. I not let children die again if I can help." There was something in his voice when he mentioned his family, a pain that transcended language and cultural differences. Sarah recognized it immediately, because it was the same fear that clutched at her own heart when she looked at her children's pale faces. The snow was coming down so hard now that Ayana was becoming difficult to see clearly, even though he was only a few yards away. The wind had picked up to a constant howl, and Sarah could feel the wagon actually moving slightly with each gust. "Where is this shelter?" Thomas called out, having to shout now to be heard. Ayana pointed toward what looked like empty prairie, but Sarah knew that the landscape could be deceptive. There might be a depression, a grove of trees, or even a cave that wasn't visible from their current position. "Half-day ride in good weather," Ayana said. "Maybe more in storm. But we get there, or we all die trying." The simple honesty of his statement somehow made Sarah trust him more than any elaborate reassurance might have. He wasn't promising them safety. He was offering them a chance, which was more than they had staying with their broken wagon. Thomas looked at the wheel again, then at the sky, then at his family. Sarah could see the moment when he accepted the reality of their situation. His shoulders sagged slightly, and he set down the tools he'd been holding. "We'll need to take what we can carry," he said, already moving toward the back of the wagon. Food, blankets, the baby's things. Sarah began gathering their most essential possessions while Thomas unhitched the oxen. They would have to abandon the wagon and most of their belongings, including the precious furniture and tools they had planned to use to start their new life in Oregon Territory. But none of that mattered if they didn't live to see another day. Ayana waited patiently while they packed, his horse stamping and snorting in the increasing wind. When Thomas approached with the oxen, the warrior shook his head. "Animals too slow in deep snow," he said. "Leave them. They maybe find shelter, maybe not. But they're not safe family." The decision to abandon their oxen was almost as hard as leaving the wagon. These animals had pulled them across half the continent, and leaving them felt like abandoning family members. But Sarah could see the logic in Ayana's words. The beasts were already struggling against the wind, and in deep snow they would become more burden than help. As they finished packing their makeshift bundles, the storm reached a new level of intensity. The snow was no longer falling in individual flakes, but seemed to be moving in solid sheets. The wind was strong enough that Sarah had to hold on to the wagon to keep from being knocked over, and speaking required shouting directly into someone's ear. Ayana dismounted and began helping them secure their supplies. He worked efficiently, his movements practiced and confident even in the chaos of the storm. Sarah noticed that he was careful around the children, his manner gentle despite his intimidating appearance. "Little ones ride with me," he said, as they prepared to leave. Safer that way. Sarah's maternal instincts rebelled against the idea of letting this stranger carry her children. But she could see that his horse was larger and stronger than she had initially realized, easily capable of carrying multiple riders. More importantly, Ayana clearly knew how to travel in these conditions, while she and Thomas were struggling just to stay upright. Emma clung to Sarah's leg, frightened by the storm and the strange man who was going to lead them into the unknown. Baby Rebecca had fallen into an exhausted sleep that worried Sarah almost as much as her earlier crying had. "It's going to be all right," Sarah whispered to Emma, though she wasn't sure she believed it herself. "This man is going to help us find a warm place to wait out the storm." Jacob, trying to be brave, helped his father lift Emma up to sit in front of Ayana on his horse. The warrior's large hands were surprisingly gentle as he arranged the children, safely wrapping part of his buffalo robe around them for extra warmth. "You hold tight to horse," Ayana told Jacob. "No matter what happened, you hold tight. Understand?" The boy nodded solemnly, his young face set with determination. Sarah felt a surge of pride at her son's courage, even as her heart ached with fear for what lay ahead. Thomas took baby Rebecca, while Sarah gathered the last of their supplies. The wind was now strong enough to actually push them around, and the snow was beginning to accumulate rapidly on the ground. Looking back at their wagon, already becoming obscured by the storm, Sarah felt like she was saying goodbye to her old life forever. Ayana mounted his horse again, the children secure in front of him, and looked down at Sarah and Thomas. "We go now," he said. "Storm get much worse. You stay close, you follow where I go. You get lost in this, you die quick." As they began walking into the white wall of the storm, following Ayana's horse through snow that was already ankle deep, Sarah wondered if they were making a terrible mistake. But when she looked back one last time, their wagon had already disappeared completely in the blowing snow, as if it had never existed at all. The journey into the storm was like walking through a nightmare. The wind howled with such intensity that it seemed to come from all directions at once, driving snow into their faces and making it nearly impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. Sarah kept one hand on Thomas's arm and the other clutching her bundle of supplies, following the dark shape of Ayana's horse through a world that had turned completely white. Every step was a struggle against wind that tried to push them backward, and snow that was rapidly getting deeper. Sarah's feet quickly became numb with cold, and she could feel ice forming on her eyebrows and around the edges of her scarf. The sound of the storm was deafening, a constant roar that made communication impossible except for occasional shouted words. Time seemed to lose all meaning as they struggled forward. Sarah had no idea if they had been walking for minutes or hours. Her world had narrowed to the simple task of putting one foot in front of the other, following the horse's tracks before the wind filled them with snow. Several times she stumbled and nearly fell, saved only by Thomas's strong grip on her arm. Through the chaos of the storm, she occasionally caught glimpses of Ayana on his horse, sitting straight and confident despite the terrible conditions. The children were wrapped in his buffalo robe, and she could see that he was using his own body to shield them from the worst of the wind. The sight gave her strength to keep going, when every instinct told her to stop and rest. As they pushed deeper into the storm, Sarah began to understand why Ayana had been so insistent about leaving immediately. The blizzard was getting worse with every passing minute, and she could feel the temperature dropping even as the wind increased. This was the kind of storm that transformed familiar landscapes into alien territory, the kind that swallowed travelers whole and didn't give them back until spring. But somehow, incredibly, Ayana seemed to know exactly where he was going. Even when Sarah couldn't see any landmarks through the driving snow, the warrior continued forward with the confidence of someone following a clear path. His horse never hesitated, never seemed uncertain about direction, as if both rider and animal possessed some internal compass that worked even in conditions where the sun was completely hidden and every direction looked identical. The storm had transformed them from a family of settlers and a lone Comanche warrior into something else entirely. Survivors bound together by the simple necessity of staying alive. In the face of nature's fury, the differences between their worlds seemed suddenly small and unimportant. What mattered now was trust, cooperation, and the shared determination to see another dawn. As they continued their desperate journey through the blizzard, Sarah found herself praying to whatever spirits or gods might be listening, whether they belonged to her Methodist faith or to Ayana's Comanche beliefs. In a storm this fierce, she thought, all prayers probably reached the same destination anyway. The horse stopped so suddenly that Sarah nearly walked into its hindquarters. Through the swirling snow, she could barely make out Ayana dismounting with the children still wrapped in his buffalo robe. The storm continued its relentless assault, but something had changed. The wind seemed less fierce, though Sarah couldn't understand why, until Ayana appeared beside her through the white chaos. "We hear," he said simply, his voice somehow carrying despite the continuing howl of the storm. "This place safe?" Sarah looked around in confusion. All she could see was more snow and wind, an endless white wilderness that looked exactly like every other stretch of prairie they had struggled through. But as Ayana led them forward, taking her arm to guide her steps, she began to realize they were moving downward. The ground beneath her feet was sloping, gradually at first, then more steeply. "Careful," Ayana warned as they descended. "Rocks here, easy to fall." Thomas, carrying baby Rebecca, who had mercifully stayed asleep through most of their terrible journey, stayed close behind them. The wind was definitely less intense now, and Sarah could see that they were entering some kind of natural depression in the landscape. The walls on either side of them rose higher with each step they took, providing blessed relief from the storm's fury. Within minutes, they had descended into what could only be described as a hidden valley. The snow was still falling heavily, but the howling wind that had tormented them for hours was reduced to a manageable whisper. Steep walls of earth and rock rose on three sides, creating a natural windbreak that made the space feel almost peaceful compared to the hell they had just endured. "How did you know this was here?" Thomas asked, his voice hoarse from shouting over the storm. He looked around the protected valley with amazement, as if they had discovered a secret room in a house he thought he knew completely. Ayana was already helping Jacob and Emma down from his horse, both children stiff with cold, but alive and alert. "My people know this place long time," he said. "When big storms come, we come here. Safe place for many, many winters." As Sarah's eyes adjusted to their new surroundings, she could see evidence of previous occupation. There were the remains of old fire circles, blackened stones arranged in patterns that spoke of careful use over many years. Near the back wall of the valley, she could make out what looked like the entrance to a cave, dark against the lighter stone around it. "There is cave," Ayana confirmed, following her gaze. "Deep, warm, dry. Good place for children to sleep safe." Emma, despite her exhaustion and fear, looked around with the curiosity of childhood. "Mama, it's like a secret place," she said, her voice filled with wonder despite everything they had been through. Sarah felt tears of relief freeze on her cheeks as she realized that they were truly safe, at least for now. The valley was completely hidden from the prairie above, invisible to anyone who didn't know exactly where to look. The storm that had threatened to kill them all was now raging harmlessly overhead, while they stood in relative calm. Ayana began unpacking supplies from his horse with the efficiency of someone who had done this many times before. From hidden bundles, he produced dried wood that had somehow stayed dry despite the storm, and within minutes he had a fire started in one of the existing stone circles. The flames danced cheerfully in the protected space, providing both warmth and light as the storm-darkened sky above them continued to dump snow. How long will the storm last? Thomas asked as they gathered round the fire. Baby Rebecca had awakened and was looking around with the confused expression of someone who couldn't quite remember how she had gotten to this strange place. Ayana studied the sky above the valley walls, reading signs that Sarah couldn't even see. Maybe 2 days, maybe 3, he said. Big storm, take time to pass. But we have food, water, shelter. We wait. The prospect of spending several days in close quarters with a Comanche warrior would have terrified Sarah under normal circumstances. But the journey through the storm had created a bond between them that transcended her previous fears. This man had saved their lives, and more importantly, he had shown genuine care for her children's welfare. As they settled around the fire, Ayana began sharing food from his own supplies. He produced strips of dried meat that tasted better than any meal Sarah could remember, and a leather pouch containing some kind of ground grain that could be mixed with water to make a nourishing mush for baby Rebecca. "You don't have to share your food with us," Sarah said, suddenly aware that their presence was depleting his winter stores. "We have some supplies of our own." Ayana looked at her with an expression that might have been amusement. "In storm like this, all people same," he said. "No white, no Indian, only people trying to stay alive. Food belonged to everyone who needed it." The simple wisdom of his words struck Sarah profoundly. She had spent her entire life thinking of Indians as dangerous others, fundamentally different from her own people. But sitting here around this fire, watching Ayana gently help Emma eat her share of the dried meat, she realized how foolish those assumptions had been. As the day wore on, they organized their temporary camp with surprising efficiency. Thomas and Ayana worked together to gather more firewood from the supplies the warrior had cached in the valley over previous years. Sarah explored the cave and found it exactly as promised, deep, dry, and warm enough to provide comfortable sleeping space for the entire group. The children, resilient in the way that only children can be, began to adapt to their strange circumstances with remarkable speed. Jacob helped gather stones to improve their fire circle, while Emma collected snow in their cooking pot to melt for drinking water. Even baby Rebecca seemed content, crawling around on the blankets they had spread near the fire and babbling happily at the dancing flames. As evening approached and the storm continued to rage above them, Sarah found herself in conversation with Ayana while Thomas played with the children. The warrior spoke better English than she had initially realized, and she learned that he had picked up the language through trade and occasional contact with white settlers. "You said you lost your family in a winter storm," Sarah said gently, not wanting to intrude on painful memories, but curious about the man who had saved them. "I'm sorry for your loss."
Ayana stared into the fire for a long moment before responding.
3 winters ago, he said quietly. Late snow, like now. My woman, she ready to have baby soon. Storm come fast, we not reach safe place in time. He paused, and Sarah could see the old pain still sharp in his eyes. Baby born in storm, both die from cold before sun come again. The simple tragedy of his words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She looked at her own children, warm and safe because of this man's knowledge and generosity, and felt a profound sense of gratitude mixed with grief for his losses. 2 sons also, Ayana continued. Boys, like your Jacob. Brave, strong, want to be warriors like father. Storm take them too. Sarah found herself reaching across the fire to touch his hand, a gesture that would have been unthinkable just days before. I can't imagine that kind of loss, she said. I'm so sorry. Ayana looked at her hand on his, and for a moment something passed between them that had nothing to do with their different backgrounds or cultures. It was simply one human being recognizing another's pain, offering comfort across the boundaries that usually divided people. Is why I help you, he said softly. Cannot save my children, but maybe save yours. Make something good from bad thing that happened. The conversation was interrupted by Emma's delighted laughter. She had discovered that the valley walls created an echo, and she was calling out words and listening to them bounce back to her. The sound of child's joy in the midst of such harsh circumstances seemed to lift everyone's spirits. As night fell and they prepared to sleep in the cave, Sarah realized that something fundamental had shifted in her understanding of the world. This man, who she had been taught to fear and distrust, had shown her family more genuine kindness than many of their white neighbors back in Ohio ever had. His actions were motivated not by any hope of reward or recognition, but by a simple human desire to prevent the kind of tragedy that had devastated his own life. Thomas, practical as always, was concerned about their long-term situation. What happens after the storm passes? He asked as they banked the fire for the night. We've lost our wagon, our oxen, most of our supplies. Fort Kearney not far, Ayana said. When storm end, I take you there. Soldiers help you. Maybe find new wagon, new animals for journey west. The offer was generous beyond anything they could have hoped for, but Sarah could see the discomfort in her husband's face. Thomas was a proud man who had never liked accepting charity, and being dependent on an Indian's help clearly challenged his assumptions about himself and his place in the world. We'll find a way to repay your kindness, Thomas said stiffly. Ayana looked genuinely puzzled by the comment. No need for pay, he said. When people help people, no cost. Only right thing to do. That night, as they settled into the warmth and safety of the cave, Sarah listened to the storm continuing to rage above them. The wind howled and snow fell with unabated fury, but they were safe and warm, alive because of the generosity of a stranger who owed them nothing. She lay awake for a long time, thinking about the strange turns her life had taken. This morning, she had been Sarah Mackenzie, pioneer woman heading west with her family to build a new life. Tonight, she was still that woman, but she was also something more. She was someone who had learned that survival sometimes meant abandoning old prejudices and trusting in the kindness of people she had been taught to fear. Outside, the blizzard raged on, but inside their hidden sanctuary, 5 people from 2 different worlds slept peacefully, bound together by the simple fact that they had chosen to help each other live through the darkness. The second day of the storm tested their small community in different ways. The initial relief of finding safety had worn off, replaced by the restless energy that comes from being confined in a small space. The children were growing bored and cranky. Thomas was increasingly uncomfortable with their dependence on Ayana's help, and Sarah found herself caught in the middle, trying to maintain harmony while dealing with her own complex emotions about their situation. Ayana, she noticed, seemed completely at ease with their circumstances. He moved through the day with a calm patience that she envied, always finding something useful to do. He taught Jacob how to make arrowheads from pieces of flint he found in the valley walls, showed Emma how to weave grass into simple patterns that could be used for baskets or decorations, and somehow managed to keep baby Rebecca entertained with games that required nothing more than his hands and his gentle voice. He's good with children, Sarah observed to Thomas during a quiet moment when Ayana was outside checking on his horse. Too good, Thomas replied grimly. Makes me wonder what he really wants from us. Sarah felt a flash of irritation at her husband's continued suspicion.
He wants nothing from us, Thomas.
Can't you see that? He's helping us because it's the right thing to do. There's always a price for help like this, Thomas insisted. Men don't risk their lives for strangers without expecting something in return. Before Sarah could respond, Ayana returned to the cave, stamping snow off his moccasins and carrying an armload of wood. If he had overheard their conversation, he gave no sign of it, simply adding fuel to their fire and settling down to continue working on a pair of snowshoes he was crafting from branches and leather strips. Storm still strong, he reported. Maybe 1 more day, maybe 2. Hard to tell. That afternoon, while the children napped and Thomas dozed by the fire, Sarah found herself alone with Ayana for the first time since their arrival in the valley. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the storm above and watching the fire dance between the stones of their circle. Can I ask you something? Sarah said eventually. Ayana looked up from the arrowhead he was shaping for Jacob. Yes. Why did you really stop to help us? You could have ridden past our wagon and sought shelter on your own. It would have been safer for you. The warrior considered her question seriously before answering. When I see broken wagon, children crying in storm, he said slowly, I see my own family again. I remember what it feels like to be afraid for little ones, to know they might die and you cannot stop it. He paused, his hands still working the stone with practiced skill. Maybe if someone helped my family that day, they still be alive. So I help yours. Is circle, you understand? Sarah did understand, perhaps better than he realized. The idea of helping others, not for reward but to honor those who had been lost, to create meaning from senseless tragedy, resonated deeply with her own faith and values. Your family would be proud of what you've done for us, she said quietly. Ayana smiled for the first time since she had known him, an expression that transformed his weathered face. Maybe so, he said. I hope so. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah found herself studying this remarkable man who had turned their desperate situation into something almost pleasant. She watched how he interacted with her children, always patient, always gentle, never raising his voice even when Emma got too close to the fire or Jacob knocked over the water pot. He treated them with the same careful attention she had seen him give to his horse, making sure they were fed and warm and safe. More than that, she began to see the intelligence behind his careful planning. The valley wasn't just a convenient shelter. It was a carefully chosen refuge stocked with supplies and organized for maximum efficiency. The cave held stores of food and firewood that had been accumulated over several seasons. There were extra blankets cached in hidden spots, tools wrapped in waterproof hides, even medicines made from plants she didn't recognize. "You've been preparing this place for a long time," she observed. "Many years," Ayana confirmed. "Every summer, I come here, make ready for winter storms. Sometimes I use it, sometimes other people find it when they need safe place." Guy Yu Kang. Good to be ready. The practical wisdom of his approach impressed her. While her own people often seemed to approach the frontier with a combination of hope and stubbornness, fighting against the harsh conditions rather than learning to work with them, Ayana had created a system that acknowledged the reality of prairie winters and prepared for them accordingly. That evening, as they gathered around the fire for their simple meal, Emma surprised everyone by asking Ayana to tell them a story. The warrior looked uncomfortable with the request at first, but when all three children chimed in to encourage him, he relented. The story he told was unlike anything Sarah had ever heard. It was about a great storm that came to the world when the spirits became angry with people for forgetting how to help each other. The storm raged for many days and nights, freezing rivers and burying villages, until finally a small group of people from different tribes came together in a hidden place much like their own valley. "The people. They argue first," Ayana said, his voice taking on the cadence of someone accustomed to storytelling. "Each think their way best, their people most important. But Storm not care about different tribes. Storm treat all people same. So people learn to work together, share food, share warmth, share stories." Emma was transfixed, her eyes wide in the firelight. "What happened to the storm?" she asked. "Storm see that people remember how to be kind to each other," Ayana continued. "So Storm get tired, go away to sleep. And people, they never forget lesson. They remember that all people same inside, no matter what they look like, where they come from." Jacob, ever practical like his father, asked, "Is that really what happened? Is that why storms come?" Ayana's expression grew thoughtful. "Stories not always about what really happened," he said. "Sometimes stories about what should happen, about what we hope for." After the children had gone to sleep in the back of the cave, Sarah and Thomas sat with Ayana around the dying fire. The storm was still raging above them, but it seemed less intense now, as if it might finally be beginning to weaken. "That was a beautiful story," Sarah said. "Do your people have many stories like that?" "Many stories," Ayana confirmed. "Stories for teaching, stories for remembering, stories for hope when times are hard." Thomas, who had been quiet most of the evening, finally spoke.
"I owe you an apology," he said awkwardly.
"I've been suspicious of your motives, and I was wrong. What you've done for my family, there's no way we can ever repay it." Ayana looked puzzled again by the notion of repayment. "You not understand yet," he said gently. "Help not. Something you pay for. Help is gift that move from person to person, like fire that light new fire but not get smaller. You help someone else someday, and gift keep moving. Is how world's supposed to work." The simple profundity of his words settled over them as they prepared for their second night in the cave. Sarah thought about all the times in her life when she had been helped by others, and all the times she had been too busy, or too suspicious, or too proud to offer help in return. The storm had forced her to accept help from someone she had been taught to fear, and in doing so, it had opened her eyes to a different way of seeing the world. As she drifted off to sleep, listening to the gradually diminishing roar of the blizzard above, Sarah realized that she was no longer the same woman who had left Ohio months ago. The journey west had already changed her in ways she was only beginning to understand. But nothing had prepared her for the transformation that was happening now, in this hidden valley, in the presence of a Comanche warrior who had shown her what true generosity looked like. On the third morning, Sarah woke to an unfamiliar sound. Silence. The howling wind that had been their constant companion for 3 days had finally stopped, and sunlight was streaming into the cave entrance for the first time since their arrival. She sat up carefully, trying not to wake the children who were still sleeping peacefully beside her. Outside the cave, she could hear Ayana moving around, and when she emerged into the valley, she found him standing at the base of the slope they had descended during the storm. The transformation of the landscape was breathtaking. What had been a white hell of driving snow and savage wind was now a pristine winter wonderland, silent and beautiful, under a crystal-clear blue sky. "Storm is finished," Ayana said when he noticed her approach. "Good day for travel to fort." Sarah looked up at the valley walls, now clearly visible for the first time. They were higher and steeper than she had realized, and the slope leading back to the prairie above was completely buried under several feet of snow. "How will we get out of here?" she asked. Ayana pointed to what looked like a natural path that wound up one of the less steep walls. "Old trail," he said. "Hard work, but possible. We go slow, careful, everyone get out safe." The prospect of leaving their warm sanctuary filled Sarah with mixed emotions. The valley had become a place of safety and unexpected fellowship, and she wasn't eager to return to the harsh realities of the outside world. More than that, she knew that once they reached Fort Kearney, their time with Ayana would end, and she found herself reluctant to say goodbye to this remarkable man who had shown her family such kindness. Thomas was less sentimental about their departure. He emerged from the cave looking relieved and eager to get moving. "The sooner we reach the fort, the sooner we can figure out how to replace our wagon and supplies," he said. "We've lost too much time already." The practical concerns of their situation were indeed pressing. They had lost everything except the few supplies they had been able to carry, and winter was far from over. Even if they could replace their wagon and oxen at Fort Kearney, the delay would make their continued journey west much more dangerous. Ayana seemed to understand Thomas's urgency, but he also recognized the challenges ahead. "Travel hard in deep snow," he said. "Maybe take 2 days to reach fort. Need to be ready for cold nights without shelter like this." They spent the morning preparing for departure, packing their few belongings and organizing supplies for the journey ahead. Sarah watched her children say goodbye to the valley that had been their home for 3 days, and she could see that they too had formed an attachment to this special place. Emma picked up a small piece of flint that Ayana had shaped into a smooth oval for her to play with. "Can I keep this to remember the secret valley?" she asked. "Of course," Ayana said, his voice gentle. "And you remember story too, about people helping people." Jacob was more interested in the practical skills Ayana had taught him. "Will you show me more about tracking and finding direction?" he asked. "I teach you on trail," Ayana promised. "Good skills for boy to know." As they prepared to climb out of the valley, Sarah found herself growing increasingly anxious about something that had nothing to do with the physical challenges of the journey ahead.
Cherabout biannual save the turnip intense is married into his psyche.
During their days in the cave, she had become acutely aware of how much they owed to Ayana's generosity, and she was tormented by the knowledge that they had no way to repay him adequately. More troubling still was a growing awareness of her own attraction to this man who had saved her family. It wasn't just gratitude, though that was certainly part of it. There was something about his quiet strength, his gentle way with her children, his profound wisdom about survival and human nature, that drew her in ways that confused and frightened her. She was a married woman, a mother, a Christian, who had been raised to believe in the sanctity of marriage and the importance of proper moral behavior. But somewhere during their 3 days together, she had begun to see Ayana not just as their savior, but as a man unlike any she had ever known. The realization filled her with guilt and self-recrimination, but she couldn't deny the truth of her feelings. The climb out of the valley was every bit as difficult as Ayana had predicted. The snow was knee-deep in most places, deeper in others where the wind had created drifts. They had to stop frequently to rest, and several times Ayana had to help carry one of the children through particularly challenging sections. Sarah found herself struggling not just with the physical demands of the climb, but with the proximity to Ayana that the difficult terrain required. When he offered his hand to help her over a particularly steep section, the contact sent an electric shock through her that had nothing to do with the cold. When he lifted baby Rebecca from her arms to carry the child over a difficult stretch, their bodies briefly pressed together in a way that made her heart race. She told herself that these reactions were simply the result of stress and exhaustion, that any woman in her situation would feel grateful and perhaps confused about a man who had shown such heroic kindness. But deep down she knew it was more than that, and the knowledge filled her with shame. Thomas, struggling with the climb and focused on the practical challenges ahead, seemed oblivious to his wife's internal turmoil. He was clearly eager to reach the fort and begin the process of rebuilding their supplies for the continued journey west. Several times during the climb, he talked about the need to move quickly once they reached civilization to make up for lost time. "We'll need to find passage on another wagon train," he said during one of their rest stops. "Can't afford to wait until spring to continue west." Ayana, who was sharing dried meat with the children, looked thoughtful. "Many wagon trains stop at fort in winter," he said. "Maybe you find good people to travel with." When they finally reached the prairie above the valley, Sarah was amazed by the transformation of the landscape. The storm had left several feet of snow everywhere, turning the familiar rolling hills into an alien wonderland of white drifts and wind-carved sculptures. The sun was brilliant against the snow, almost painful to look at directly, and the air was so clear that she felt like she could see for hundreds of miles in every direction. Ayana spent several minutes studying the terrain, reading signs in the snow and the position of the sun that Sarah couldn't interpret. Finally, he pointed toward what looked like empty prairie to her untrained eye. "Fort that way," he said confidently. "Good trail under snow, not too hard to follow." They began walking across the snow-covered prairie, Ayana's horse breaking trail for the rest of them to follow. The going was slow but steady, and Sarah found herself marveling at the warrior's ability to navigate across a landscape that looked completely featureless to her. Somehow, he seemed to know exactly where they were going, even when there were no visible landmarks to guide them. As they walked, Jacob peppered Ayana with questions about tracking and navigation, eager to learn the skills that seemed so natural to the warrior. Ayana was patient with the boy's curiosity, pointing out subtle signs in the snow and the landscape that revealed their direction and progress. "See how snow blow here?" he said, pointing to a drift that looked identical to dozens of others to Sarah's eyes. "Wind always blows same way in winter. Snow tell you which direction is north." Emma was more interested in the beauty of their surroundings, exclaiming over the way the sun made the snow sparkle like diamonds, and delighting in the way her breath formed clouds in the cold air. Even baby Rebecca seemed enchanted by the winter wonderland, reaching out from Sarah's arms to catch snowflakes on her mittened hands. But as the day wore on and they continued their steady progress across the snowy prairie, Sarah found herself growing increasingly distressed about their approaching separation. In just a day or two, they would reach Fort Kearney, and Ayana would return to his own life while her family began the process of rebuilding their journey west. The thought of never seeing him again was surprisingly painful. In just a few days, this man had become more than their savior. He had become a friend, a teacher, someone whose wisdom and kindness had touched all of their lives in profound ways. The idea of saying goodbye forever felt like losing a member of their family. More disturbing still was the growing certainty that her feelings for Ayana went far beyond friendship or gratitude. Every time she looked at him, every time he smiled at one of her children, or offered his strong hand to help her over a difficult patch of ground, she felt a pull toward him that she had never experienced with her own husband. The realization filled her with confusion and guilt. She loved Thomas, she told herself. He was a good man, a hard worker, a devoted father. Their marriage might not be passionate, but it was solid and respectable, and based on shared values and goals. What she was feeling for Ayana was surely just a temporary aberration, a result of the extreme circumstances they had shared. But as they made camp that night in a shallow depression that provided some shelter from the wind, Sarah found herself unable to stop watching Ayana as he moved around their small campsite. There was something about the way he carried himself, the quiet confidence with which he performed every task, that drew her eyes again and again. When he sat down beside the fire they had built, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body, Sarah had to fight the urge to move closer still. The attraction she felt was physical, certainly, but it was more than that. It was an attraction to his character, his wisdom, his fundamental decency in a world that often seemed harsh and unforgiving. That night, as they settled into their sleeping arrangements around the fire, Sarah lay awake, staring at the stars that seemed impossibly bright in the clear winter sky. Thomas slept beside her, exhausted by the day's travel, while the children were bundled together nearby. Across the fire, she could see Ayana's form, apparently sleeping but somehow always alert, ready to respond to any danger. She thought about her life before the storm, the predictable routine of their westward journey, the clear sense of purpose that had driven them to leave Ohio and seek a new life in Oregon Territory. That woman seemed like a stranger now, someone who had lived in a much smaller world, with much simpler ideas about right and wrong, about who could be trusted and who should be feared. The storm had stripped away more than just their material possessions. It had forced her to confront her own prejudices and assumptions, and in doing so, it had revealed parts of herself she hadn't known existed. She was capable of trusting a stranger from a completely different culture, capable of accepting help without shame, capable of feeling attracted to a man who represented everything she had been taught to fear. The knowledge was both liberating and terrifying. If she could be so wrong about Ayana, what else might she be wrong about? What other assumptions about her life and her world might crumble under closer examination? As dawn broke over their small camp, painting the snow-covered prairie in shades of pink and gold, Sarah made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of the journey to Fort Kearney. She was going to tell Ayana how she felt about him. not because she expected anything to come of it, not because she planned to abandon her family or her responsibilities, but because the truth between them felt too important to leave unspoken.
The second day of travel passed much like the first, with steady progress across the snowy landscape and Ayana's patient instruction of Jacob in the arts of winter survival.
But Sarah found herself increasingly distracted, rehearsing in her mind what she might say to the warrior when the opportunity presented itself.
Late in the afternoon, that opportunity came when they stopped to rest beside a small grove of cottonwood trees. Thomas was helping the children gather deadwood for their evening fire, and Sarah found herself alone with Ayana as he tended to his horse. "I need to tell you something," she said, her heart pounding so hard she was sure he must be able to hear it. Ayana looked up from checking his horse's hooves, his dark eyes curious and patient. Sarah took a deep breath, knowing that once she spoke the words, she could never take them back. "I want you to know that what I'm about to say has nothing to do with gratitude for saving our lives, and everything to do with who you are as a man." The warrior straightened up, and she could see in his expression that he already knew what she was going to say. There was understanding in his eyes, and something else that might have been sadness. "I'm attracted to you," Sarah said simply. "More than that, I'm drawn to you in ways that confuse and frighten me. I know it's wrong, I know it's impossible, but I needed you to know before we reach the fort and say goodbye forever." Ayana was quiet for a long moment, his gaze steady and thoughtful. When he finally spoke, his voice was gentle but firm. "I know," he said simply. "I feel same thing. But you are married woman, mother to children who need you. And I am Comanche warrior, in white man's world. No future for us together." The acknowledgement that her feelings were reciprocated sent a jolt through Sarah that was part joy and part devastating sadness. To know that he cared for her too, and to know at the same time that nothing could ever come of it, was almost unbearable. What if things were different, she asked, hating herself for the question, but unable to stop herself from asking it. Ayana stepped closer, close enough that she could see her own reflection in his dark eyes. "If things different, if we meet in different world, different time." He paused, and she could see the struggle in his expression. "Maybe we find way to be together, but things not different, things as they are." Sarah felt tears starting to form, and she blinked them back angrily. She had known what his answer would be before she asked the question. He was too honorable, too wise, too fundamentally decent to encourage her to abandon her family for an impossible dream. "I know you're right," she whispered. "I just needed you to know." Ayana reached out slowly, carefully, and touched her face with his fingertips. The contact was brief, gentle, and it conveyed more tenderness than any passionate embrace could have. "You brave woman," he said softly. "Good mother, good person. Your husband, lucky man. Even if he not know it." The sound of Thomas and the children returning with firewood broke the spell between them, and Ayana stepped back, his expression once again calm and controlled. But Sarah knew that something had changed between them. Some invisible line had been crossed that could never be uncrossed. As they prepared their camp for the night, Sarah found herself both grateful and tormented by what had passed between them. She was glad she had spoken her truth, glad to know that her feelings were reciprocated, but the knowledge made their approaching separation even more painful. That night, as they sat around their fire eating their simple meal, Sarah watched Ayana interact with her family and knew that she would carry the memory of these moments with her for the rest of her life. His gentle patience with the children, his respectful courtesy toward Thomas, his quiet strength in the face of hardship, all of it would become part of her, a secret treasure that she would guard carefully in the years to come. Tomorrow, they would reach Fort Kearney. Tomorrow, they would begin the process of saying goodbye to the man who had saved their lives and, in doing so, had changed Sarah's understanding of herself and the world forever. Tonight, she would memorize every detail of his face in the firelight, every gesture, every word, storing them away against the long loneliness she knew was coming. The fire burned low as they prepared for sleep, and Sarah looked up at the stars one last time, wondering if Ayana would think of her sometimes in the years to come, if he would remember the woman who had offered herself to survive a blizzard and learned instead what it meant to truly live. Fort Kearney appeared on the horizon like a mirage, its wooden buildings and American flag a stark reminder of the civilized world they were returning to after their days in the wilderness. Sarah felt a complex mix of relief and loss as they approached the outpost, knowing that their extraordinary journey with Ayana was about to end. The fort was busier than Sarah had expected for winter. Several wagon trains had stopped here to wait out the worst of the season, and the compound buzzed with the activity of families making repairs, trading supplies, and planning their continued journeys west. Soldiers in blue uniforms moved through the crowds, and Sarah could smell cooking fires and hear the familiar sounds of children playing. As they approached the main gate, Sarah noticed how the mood of their small group had changed. Thomas walked with renewed confidence, eager to rejoin the company of other white settlers and begin the practical work of replacing their lost supplies. The children were excited by the prospect of seeing new faces and playing with other young people. Only Sarah felt the weight of impending loss. Ayana, she noticed, had grown more reserved as they neared the fort. His earlier ease and openness had been replaced by a careful formality, as if he were putting on armor in preparation for entering hostile territory. Sarah realized that for him, the fort represented not safety and civilization, but suspicion and potential danger. The reaction of the soldiers at the gate confirmed her fears. When they saw Ayana approaching with a white family, several guards stepped forward with weapons ready, their faces hard with suspicion. "State your business," the sergeant in charge called out, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. Thomas stepped forward quickly. "This man saved our lives," he said firmly. "Our wagon broke down in the storm 3 days ago. We would have died without his help." The sergeant looked skeptical, his eyes moving from Ayana to the Mackenzie family and back again. "That may be," he said slowly, "but we don't allow Indians inside the fort without proper escort and authorization." Sarah felt a surge of indignation at the man's tone. After everything Ayana had done for them, to be treated like a potential threat was insulting beyond words. "This man is a hero," she said, her voice sharp with anger. "He risked his own life to save my children." "I'm sure he did, ma'am," the sergeant replied with patronizing patience. "But regulations are regulations. The Indian can make his report here and then move on. You folks are welcome inside." Ayana stepped forward, his expression calm despite the obvious insult. "Is all right," he said to Sarah and Thomas. "I not need to go inside fort. I bring you safe, that is enough." But Sarah could see the hurt in his eyes, the resignation of someone who had experienced this kind of treatment many times before. The contrast between the warm acceptance he had shown their family and the cold suspicion he was receiving here was stark and painful. Thomas, to his credit, tried to intervene. "Sergeant, this man saved our lives and guided us safely through the worst storm I've ever seen. The least we can do is offer him a hot meal and a warm place to sleep." The sergeant's expression softened slightly at Thomas's obvious sincerity. "I understand your gratitude, sir, but I have my orders." Album. Indians don't stay inside the fort unless they're prisoners or scouts under military supervision. Sarah felt something snap inside her at the casual cruelty of the man's words. Before she could stop herself, she stepped forward, her eyes blazing with fury. "Then you can put us outside with him," she said loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "If this fort is too good for the man who saved our lives, then it's too good for us as well." A murmur ran through the crowd of settlers who had gathered to watch the confrontation. Thomas looked shocked by his wife's outburst, and the sergeant's face darkened with annoyance. "Now see here, ma'am," the soldier began, but Sarah cut him off. "No, you see here," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the compound. "This man found us dying in a blizzard and took us to safety. He shared his food with us, kept our children warm, and guided us here through conditions that would have killed us all. And your response is to treat him like a criminal?" The crowd around them had grown larger, and Sarah could see that her words were having an impact. Many of the settlers were nodding in agreement, and several of the women looked ashamed of their military's treatment of Ayana. An older officer emerged from one of the buildings, drawn by the commotion. He was clearly senior to the sergeant, and his manner was more diplomatic as he approached their group. "What seems to be the problem here?" he asked, his eyes taking in the situation quickly. The sergeant snapped to attention. "Sir, we have a white family vouching for an Indian who brought them in from the storm. The woman is demanding that we allow the Indian inside the fort." The officer studied Ayana for a long moment, his experienced eyes noting details that the younger sergeant had missed. "You're Comanche," he said, and it wasn't a question. Ayana nodded. "Yes. I've seen you before," the officer continued. "You've brought lost travelers to the fort several times over the past few years. Always during bad weather, always folks who wouldn't have made it on their own." "Maybe so," Ayana replied carefully. The officer turned to Thomas. "Tell me what happened." Thomas recounted their story, describing the broken wagon wheel, the approaching storm, and Ayana's offer of help. He spoke honestly about their initial suspicions and their growing trust, as the warrior proved his good intentions time and again. "He saved our lives, Captain," Thomas concluded. "There's no question about that. Without his help, my wife and children would have died in that storm." The captain nodded thoughtfully, then turned to Sarah. "And you, ma'am? You seem quite passionate about this man's treatment." Sarah felt all eyes on her as she considered her response. This was her chance to tell the truth about what Ayana had meant to their family, to make these people understand the depth of character he had shown. "Captain," she said, choosing her words carefully, "in 3 days with this man, I saw more genuine kindness and honor than I've encountered in most white communities. He asked for nothing in return for his help. He shared his food, his shelter, his knowledge freely. He was gentle with my children and respectful to my husband. If there were more men like him in this world, it would be a far better place." The captain looked surprised by the passion in her voice, but also thoughtful. He turned back to Ayana with what seemed like genuine respect. "You have a name?" he asked. "I am called Ayana," the warrior replied. "Well, Ayana, it seems you've made quite an impression on this family. Mrs. Mackenzie is right that we owe you better treatment than you've received." He turned to the sergeant. "Sergeant Murphy, Mr. Ayana, is welcome to enter the fort as my personal guest. See that he's offered a meal and a place to sleep if he wants it." The sergeant looked like he wanted to argue, but military discipline won out. "Yes, sir," he said stiffly. Ayana looked uncomfortable with the attention and the special treatment. "Thank you," he said to the captain. "But I not need place to sleep. I make camp outside is better." "Nonsense," Sarah said quickly. "After everything you've done for us, you deserve a warm meal and a comfortable bed." But she could see in Ayana's eyes that he understood something she was only beginning to realize. Inside the fort, surrounded by soldiers and settlers who viewed him with suspicion at best, he would be isolated and uncomfortable. The generous hospitality he had shown their family could not be returned in this setting, not because of anyone's personal feelings, but because of the larger tensions between their two worlds. "Maybe you're right," Ayana said to the captain. "I stay one night, then go." As they entered the fort, Sarah was struck by how different everything felt from their time in the Hidden Valley. There, they had been simply people helping each other survive. Here, they were immediately categorized and separated by race, by military rank, by social status. The easier quality of their shared struggle was replaced by the complex hierarchies of civilization. The captain assigned quarters to the Mackenzie family and arranged for Ayana to have a meal in the officers' mess, a gesture that was both generous and telling. Even this act of hospitality reinforced the man's outsider status, setting him apart from the regular dining hall where he might have faced hostility from other guests. That evening, as Sarah helped settle her children in their assigned quarters, she felt the weight of everything that had happened over the past few days. Tomorrow, Ayana would leave, and they would begin the process of finding another wagon train to join for the continuation of their journey west. Life would return to its normal patterns, and their extraordinary experience would become just a story to tell around campfires. But Sarah knew that she would never be the same. The woman who had been frightened of a lone Indian rider in a storm was gone, replaced by someone who had learned that courage and kindness could come from the most unexpected sources. More than that, she had discovered parts of herself that she hadn't known existed, feelings and attractions that challenged everything she thought she knew about her own heart. Later that evening, she found Ayana sitting alone outside the mess hall, looking up at the same stars they had shared during their journey. The sight of him there, isolated even in the midst of the busy fort, broke her heart. "May I sit with you?" she asked. He nodded, and she settled beside him on the wooden steps. For a while, they sat in comfortable silence, listening to the sounds of the fort settling down for the night. "I want to apologize for how you've been treated here," Sarah said finally. Ayana shrugged. "Is what I expect. White men afraid of what they not understand. That doesn't make it right." "No," he agreed. "But being right not always matter. Sometimes just being alive is enough." Sarah thought about his words, about the resignation in his voice, and felt ashamed of her own people. "It shouldn't be this way," she said. "Many things should not be as they are," Ayana replied, but wishing not changed them. They sat quietly for a moment longer, both aware that this was likely their last private conversation. Tomorrow would bring goodbyes and practical arrangements, the business of returning to their separate lives. "I want you to know," Sarah said carefully, "that knowing you has changed me. Changed how I see the world, how I see other people. I'll never forget what you taught us." Ayana turned to look at her, his expression gentle. "You good woman, Sarah Mackenzie. You have brave heart, kind spirit. Your children lucky to have mother like you. The use of her first name sent a familiar jolt through her, a reminder of the attraction that still pulled at her despite everything. But tonight, that attraction was tempered by a deeper understanding of the impossible nature of their situation. Will you be all right? She asked. After we leave, I mean. Do you have somewhere to go, people who care about you? I have my horse, my weapons, my knowledge of the land, Ayana said. Is enough. I survived before, I survive now. But Sarah heard the loneliness in his words, the echo of losses that went far deeper than just the family he had lost in the storm. Here was a man caught between two worlds, belonging fully to neither, making his way through life with a solitary dignity that both impressed and saddened her. I wish things could be different, she said softly.
But they not different, Ayana replied, echoing his words from the night before. They exactly as they are.
As they prepared to part for the night, Sarah felt the weight of all the things she wanted to say but couldn't.
She wanted to tell him that she would think of him every day for the rest of her life. She wanted to say that meeting him had been worth all the danger and hardship they had endured. She wanted to promise that she would teach her children to see past the color of a person's skin to the character underneath. Instead, she simply said, "Thank you for everything." Ayana nodded, understanding all the words she couldn't speak. Take care of children, he said. They good children. They remember this time. Remember that different people can help each other. Maybe they make better world than we have. That night, as Sarah lay in an unfamiliar bed, listening to her children's peaceful breathing, she thought about the choice she had almost made during their conversation in the cottonwood grove. For a moment there, she had been ready to offer herself to this man who had saved their lives, ready to abandon everything for feelings she barely understood. She was glad now that his wisdom and honor had prevented such a catastrophic mistake, but she was also glad that she had been brave enough to speak her truth, to acknowledge the attraction and connection between them. Some things were too important to leave unspoken, even when speaking them changed nothing. Tomorrow would bring the pain of goodbye, but tonight she had the memory of sitting beside him under the stars, sharing a moment of perfect understanding with a man who had shown her what true nobility looked like. It would have to be enough. Dawn came too quickly to Fort Kearney, bringing with it the harsh reality of separation that Sarah had been dreading. She woke to find frost covering the windows of their quarters, a reminder that winter's grip on the land was far from broken. Today, Ayana would leave, and the extraordinary chapter of their lives would close forever. The children seemed to sense the significance of the day without being told. Emma was unusually quiet as Sarah helped her dress, and Jacob kept asking when they would see Ayana again. Even baby Rebecca seemed fussier than normal, as if she could feel the tension that filled their small room. Thomas was already up and moving, discussing their options with other travelers in the compound. There were 2 wagon trains planning to resume their westward journey once the weather improved, and both leaders were willing to accept the Mackenzie family as members. The practical business of rebuilding their lives was already underway. Sarah found Ayana outside the stables, tending to his horse in preparation for departure. The animal seemed as eager to leave the confines of the fort as his master, stamping and snorting in the cold morning air. When Ayana saw her approach, he straightened up and gave her a formal nod that felt like a return to the careful distance of strangers. You leaving this morning? Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer. Yes. Storm over, time to go. His voice was neutral, controlled, giving nothing away of what he might be feeling. Sarah had rehearsed this conversation in her mind throughout the sleepless night, but now that the moment had arrived, all her carefully planned words seemed inadequate. How do you thank someone for saving not just your life, but your understanding of what life could be? The children want to say goodbye, she said finally. Ayana nodded. I would like that. They walked together toward the quarters where Thomas was gathering their few remaining possessions. The morning was crisp and clear, with the kind of brilliant blue sky that made the snow-covered landscape sparkle like a field of diamonds. It was the kind of day that made anything seem possible, which only made their approaching separation more painful. The farewell with the children was both heartbreaking and beautiful. Emma threw her arms around Ayana's waist and refused to let go until he promised to remember her always. Jacob tried to be stoic like his father, but his eyes were bright with unshed tears as he shook the warrior's hand and thanked him for all the things he had learned. You take care of sisters, Ayana told the boy seriously. You man of family, now when father not around. Important job. Jacob nodded solemnly. clearly taking the responsibility to heart. Even baby Rebecca seemed to understand that something significant was happening, reaching out to touch Ayana's face with her tiny hands and babbling what sounded like goodbye in her own private language. Thomas's farewell was awkward, but genuine. The two men had never quite overcome their cultural differences, but their shared experience had created a grudging mutual respect that showed in their formal handshake. "I'll never forget what you did for my family," Thomas said stiffly. "If there's ever anything—" "No need," Ayana interrupted gently. "Was right thing to do. That is enough." But Thomas wasn't finished. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his father's watch, a precious family heirloom that had somehow survived their journey. "I want you to have this," he said, offering it to Ayana. "It's not much compared to what you gave us, but it's the most valuable thing I own." Ayana looked at the watch for a long moment, understanding the significance of the gesture. Then he shook his head slowly. "Thank you, but I cannot take this. Watch belong with your family, your children. Keep it. Remember that time when people from different worlds help each other." Thomas looked disappointed but not surprised. He had come to understand something of Ayana's character during their time together, enough to know that the warrior would never accept material payment for his kindness. As the formal goodbyes concluded, Sarah found herself alone with Ayana one final time. The others had drifted away to give them privacy, perhaps sensing that there were things between them that needed to be said without witnesses. For a moment, they simply stood looking at each other, two people whose lives had become unexpectedly intertwined and who were now being forced apart by circumstances beyond their control. Sarah memorized every detail of his face, knowing she would need these memories to sustain her through the long years ahead. "I have something for you," Ayana said quietly, reaching into his leather pouch. He pulled out a small object and held it out to her, a piece of carved bone, smooth and white, shaped into the form of a bird in flight. Sarah took the carving with trembling hands, feeling its weight and the incredible craftsmanship that had gone into its creation. Every feather was perfectly detailed, every curve graceful and lifelike. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "Did you make this?" Ayana nodded. "Long ago, for my woman before she died. She say it looked like her spirit free and flying. I want you to have it now." The significance of the gift overwhelmed her. This wasn't just a pretty trinket, it was something precious. Something that connected her to the most important person in his lost life. That he would give it to her spoke of feelings too deep for words. "I can't take this," Sarah said, trying to hand it back. "It's too precious, too personal." But Ayana closed her fingers around the carving with his warm hands. "Please. My woman, she would want someone like you to have it. Someone who understands what it means to love family, to protect children, to be brave when you need to be brave." Tears that Sarah had been fighting all morning finally spilled over. The gift was more than she could bear, more than she deserved. It represented trust and affection, and a connection that would outlast their physical separation. "Thank you," she managed to say through her tears. "I'll treasure it always." Ayana reached up and gently wiped the tears from her cheek with his thumb, a gesture so tender and intimate that it took her breath away. For a moment, they stood frozen like that, connected by touch and understanding and all the things they could never say. "You be happy, Sarah Mackenzie," he said softly. "You deserve happiness. Your husband, your children, they're lucky to have you. Do not forget that." "And you," Sarah replied, her voice barely a whisper. "You deserve happiness too. Don't spend your whole life alone, grieving for what's lost. Find someone to care for you." Ayana smiled sadly. "Maybe someday, when heart ready to try again." The sound of approaching horses interrupted their farewell. Other travelers were beginning to stir around the fort, preparing for their own departures. The business of the day was calling, and their private moment was ending. "I should go," Ayana said, though he made no move to leave. "I know," Sarah replied, though every fiber of her being wanted to beg him to stay. They stepped apart slowly, reluctantly, both understanding that this was truly the end. Ayana mounted his horse in one fluid motion and looked down at her one last time. "Remember story," he said. "About storm that teach people to help each other. Tell your children, tell their children. Keep story alive." Sarah nodded, clutching the bone carving to her chest. "I will. I promise." Ayana raised his hand in farewell, then turned his horse towards the fort's gate. Sarah watched him ride away until he disappeared beyond the wooden walls, taking with him a piece of her heart that she knew she would never get back. The weeks that followed were a blur of preparation and planning. The Mackenzie family joined the Morrison wagon train, a group of 15 families heading for Oregon Territory, under the leadership of an experienced guide named Captain Morrison. They purchased a used wagon and a team of oxen with money Thomas had saved for emergencies, and slowly began rebuilding their supplies for the continued journey west. The other members of their wagon train were good people, generous with advice and assistance as the Mackenzies integrated into their traveling community. But Sarah found it difficult to connect with her new companions. After the profound intimacy of her experience with Ayana, the polite social interactions of frontier life felt hollow and meaningless. She carried the bone carving with her always, tucked safely in the pocket of her dress where she could touch it whenever she needed to. Remember that the extraordinary days in the Hidden Valley had really happened. Sometimes, when the routine of daily travel became overwhelming, she would take out the carving and study its perfect details, remembering the man who had created it and the woman he had loved. The children adapted to their new circumstances with the resilience of youth, but Sarah could see that they too had been changed by their experience. Jacob had become more serious, more observant, studying the landscape and weather patterns with the intense focus Ayana had taught him. Emma talked constantly about their secret valley and the nice Indian man who had kept them safe. Even baby Rebecca seemed to look for Ayana in every group of riders they encountered on the trail. Thomas threw himself into the practical challenges of their continued journey, working hard to establish their place in the wagon train and to rebuild the material foundation for their new life in Oregon. He rarely spoke of their time with Ayana, and Sarah sensed that he was trying to put the entire episode behind him, to return to the certainties of his previous worldview. But Sarah could not forget, and as the weeks turned to months and they continued their westward journey, she found herself thinking often about the lessons Ayana had taught them, not just the practical skills of survival, but the deeper truths about human nature, about the artificial barriers that separated people, about the possibility of connection across cultural divides. One evening, as their wagon train made camp beside a rushing stream, Sarah overheard a conversation that made her blood run cold. Two of the men were discussing a recent newspaper report about conflicts between settlers and Comanche raiders further south. Their casual talk of dealing with the Indian problem and teaching the savages a lesson filled her with rage and despair. She thought of Ayana, alone somewhere on the vast prairie, and wondered if he was safe. Did he ever think of them? Did he remember the children who had learned from him? The woman who had found something in his presence that she had never known she was missing? As spring turned to summer and they crossed into Oregon Territory, Sarah began to understand the true nature of the gift Ayana had given them. It wasn't just their lives he had saved, though that would have been enough. He had shown them that the world was larger and more complex than they had imagined, that goodness could come from unexpected sources, that the categories they used to understand other people were often wrong. The bone carving became a talisman for these lessons, a physical reminder of the man who had embodied them. Sarah often found herself touching it when faced with difficult decisions, asking herself what Ayana would do, how he would respond to the challenges of building a new life in unfamiliar territory. When they finally reached the Willamette Valley and began the process of claiming land and building their new home, Sarah made sure that their cabin included a special place for the carving. She displayed it prominently on the mantel, despite Thomas's discomfort with having a pagan artifact in their Christian home. "It's not pagan," she told him firmly. "It's a reminder of kindness, of the good that people can do for each other. That's as sacred as anything in our Bible." As their children grew older and the events of that terrible winter began to fade into family history, Sarah made sure that the story of Ayana was never forgotten. She told it often, always emphasizing the warrior's nobility and selflessness, his gentle way with children, his profound understanding of what it meant to be truly civilized. Jacob grew up to become a man who judged others by their character rather than their appearance, partly because of those crucial days when he learned survival skills from a Comanche warrior. Emma became a teacher who insisted that her students learn about the complex history of the frontier, including the stories of Native Americans who had shown kindness to lost travelers. Even Rebecca, though she had no conscious memory of their rescuer, grew up with an instinctive trust in people who seemed different from herself. Years later, when Sarah was an old woman surrounded by grandchildren, they would beg her to tell again the story of the storm and the Indian who had saved them. She would take down the bone carving from its place of honor, running her weathered fingers over its smooth surface as she spoke. "His name was Ayana," she would always begin, "and he taught us that courage and kindness can come from the most unexpected places. He asked for nothing in return for saving our lives, but his gift to us was greater than he ever knew." The children would listen with wide eyes as she described the hidden valley, the warmth of the cave, the patient way Ayana had taught them about survival and generosity. But the part of the story that Sarah never told, the part she kept locked away in her own heart, was the deeper truth of what that time had meant to her. She never spoke of the attraction she had felt, the possibility of a different life that had flickered between them for those brief days. That secret she carried alone, a private treasure as precious and carefully guarded as the bone carving itself. It was the knowledge that for a few perfect days she had been truly seen and understood by someone who recognized the best parts of her nature. Sometimes, on clear winter nights when the stars seemed especially bright, Sarah would step outside their cabin and look up at the sky, remembering other nights when she had shared that view with a Comanche warrior who had shown her what honor really looked like. She would wonder if he was somewhere out there, looking at the same stars, if he ever thought of the white woman and her children who had been changed forever by his kindness. The bone carving outlived Sarah, passing down through generations of her family as a cherished heirloom. Each generation heard the story of Ayana, the Comanche warrior who had saved their ancestors during the worst storm anyone could remember. The story grew and changed with each telling, but its essential truth remained constant: that kindness transcends all boundaries, that help can come from unexpected sources, and that the measure of a person has nothing to do with the color of their skin or the culture they were born into. In the end, Ayana's greatest gift to the Mackenzie family wasn't their survival, though that had been precious beyond measure. His real gift was the understanding that the world was full of good people who looked different, believed different things, and lived according to different customs. He had shown them that beneath all the surface differences, human beings shared the same fundamental needs for safety, warmth, and connection. It was a lesson that the children carried forward into their own lives, teaching it to their children in turn. And so Ayana's wisdom continued to spread, like ripples from a stone thrown into still water, touching lives he would never know about and creating circles of understanding that grew wider with each passing generation. The bone carving still sits on a mantle somewhere in Oregon, though the family that owns it now has forgotten many of the details of the original story. They know it belonged to their great-great-grandmother, that it was made by an Indian who helped their family long ago during some kind of emergency. The specific details have been lost to time, but the carving itself remains, a silent testament to the power of kindness to transcend every barrier humans create between themselves and others. And perhaps, on certain winter nights when the wind howls across the prairie and snow falls in driving sheets, the spirit of Ayana still rides through the storm, looking for lost travelers who need guidance to safety. Perhaps his story continues, written not in words but in the countless acts of unexpected kindness that link stranger to stranger across all the artificial boundaries of race and culture and creed. The storm that Sarah Mackenzie thought would destroy her family had instead given them the greatest gift of their lives, the knowledge that in a world often harsh and unforgiving, there are always people willing to share their warmth with those who need it most. It was a lesson worth passing down through all the generations that would follow, a light to guide them through whatever storms might come.